Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs programme. My name's Emma Webb and I'm your host, and this week I'm joined, as always, by Peter Whittle, the director and founder of the New Culture Forum, and by Philip Kiszely, senior fellow, academic and cultural historian. So before we begin going on to this week's topics, this will unfortunately be my last show, but I will not be leaving the NCF team. Peter might hopefully allow me to come back and join some shows in the future. So I'll still be knocking around, but I'm going to be focusing on another project.
Emma, I have to say, first of all, thank you very much for doing it so graciously. But also, you will see from the comments, I'm sure, after this show, the sorrow that will be expressed because you're not going to be doing it. There's a real fan club going. I should know every time I've been sitting in for you.
I feel really sad about it. We're like a family.
But you are going to be coming back. You will be a guest.
Yeah, I'll still be knocking around, and I'll hopefully Peter will let me come back and guest host some things.
It should be said, actually, at our conference in April, you're going to be speaking there, aren't you?
Yes, I will be there at the St George's Day conference this year as well. So any viewers who come along, come and say hi, and I will still be knocking around. So this week we're going to be talking about the Metropolitan Police and how rotten the institution has become. We'll also be talking about the Ramadan lights that have been put up all over the West End. And we'll be talking about Boris Johnson's legacy, or what's left of it. But before we move on to that, this week we also saw the premiere of Mark Sidwell's documentary series, The West, and that will be out this Sunday. Peter can tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, well, you were there at the screening, weren't you? Well, we had a great screening of it on Tuesday here in
Ken Clark would be proud.
in Soho in London. This is, as you know, you're in it as a contributor. This is 6-part series called The West. Timing could not be better. And it is to an extent inspired by what Kenneth Clark did with Civilization back in 1969, I think it was.
That's
actually.
right.
Yes, 69. And it's presented by Mark Sidwell, and a beautiful job in filming it by the man who's currently behind the camera here, Ollie Hewitson. And it starts on Sunday. So that was a preview screening we had, and it starts this Sunday at 9:30 a.m. So please do watch, won't you? We actually have got a trailer for it here, a little clip to give people a little sense of it, if you'd like to.
Yeah.
Why do people attack the West, and why within the West does there seem to be a sort of imp of the perverse that wants to destroy everything that gave us what we have?
There are such things as British values, there are such things as Western values. We've got to be confident in what they are, and that is the only way that we will continue to thrive as a society and as a civilization.
The West is under attack. We live in the freest, healthiest and wealthiest societies in human history. Yet as authoritarian and oppressive regimes threaten us from without, a new movement within tells us to feel nothing but shame for who we are. Welcome to the West. This is my take on the great and still unfolding adventure of who we are and why it matters. This is a history of how our extraordinary, unconventional civilization came to be and why it must be defended. It's a fascinating and often unexpected journey, stretching back 15 centuries to the fall of Rome. And it starts with a mystery, the loss of Western self-confidence. What on earth happened to the West?
Well, I will definitely be rewatching it.
Well, yes, no,
I don't know about you two.
I'll certainly
but
be there. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there on Tuesday because I wanted to see the West, but I was stuck in the North. So it was the photographs.
It's a very misleading sentence.
The photographs looked stunning, and it looked like a brilliant night.
It was, and you know, somebody said actually at the screening, you could actually turn the sound out. Or rather the commentary, and just have the music and pictures, and it would almost show what is so wonderful about the West in and of itself.
Yeah.
I think that
I thought the introduction was incredibly moving.
Yes, I think so.
The viewers have all that to look forward to.
And also we've got Constantine Kissin in it. We've got Professor Nigel Bigger, good self.
Zoe Strimple.
Zoe Strimple in it, and so a lot of good things. It's great. I'm very proud of it. Because it goes right to the very, very heart of what we're meant to be doing here. You know?
I'm very excited to see the later episodes as well. So, the Metropolitan Police, rotten to the core, but I guess the question is, in what way? So the Casey review came out this week, detailing what she concluded was symptomatic of institutional racism, misogyny, sexism, and so on. And we've been talking off air about this brilliant article by Joanna Williams in Spiked. And she, I think quite rightly, you know, acknowledges the findings of this report are, you know, they show that the Met has become deeply, deeply rotten. But she questions, again, I think rightly, the use of institutional racism. She questions the wording of that conclusion, which I think is very the term is very ideologically loaded now. So what do you think about that? Do you think that she's right to question the conclusion?
Yeah, I think she is, because the term just invites a whole load of glee from organisations like the BBC, because the first time I heard about the report and the discussion of the report was a discussion on BBC Radio, and they were just loving it, you know. Now the detail is appalling. Some of the examples in the report is just absolutely appalling. So you cannot say that the Met is in any good shape at all. It's not. It's rotten. It is rotten to the core, as you say. But that doesn't mean it's institutionally racist, institutionally homophobic. Because at the same time as all of these instances are going on, and it's not just a few bad apples, it is a culture. But at the same time as all of those things are going on, you'll have people, you know, coppers in high heels and mascara. You'll have a pride lanyard, as Joanne says in the article. Actually, you'll have people, you know, taking the knee for BLM, and yet at the same time indulging in all this massively bigoted behaviour, you know, cutting the beards of Sikh colleagues and being grossly misogynistic and all of those things. But what it shows is actually that all of the wokeness, all of the indoctrination just does not work.
No, completely.
And that's the takeout from all of this, I think.
You know, I think that using the term institutional anything, it implies that if you were to remove all of the people from the institution, that there would still be something, you know, about it that would be racist, sexist, and so on. But that, of course, is not what is meant by this, because it is believed that reform is possible. And I think Mark Rowley's, the commissioner of the Met, was quite right, and he was interviewed about this on LBC. He was quite right to step back from the term institutional race, because in a way it actually hamstrings you from being able to deal with the problem, because there are things like I think it's interesting that this has come out a lot in the press, because obviously this has disturbed people deeply, and for obvious reasons, that the fridges that are used to hold rape samples
which is
weren't being properly maintained, and so the primary evidence in these rape cases was just being destroyed by the fact that the money wasn't being prioritised properly. It wasn't going on fixing these fridges, it was going on weird things like camouflage gear that you obviously don't need in London. But do you think, Peter, that using the term institutional racism or sexism or whatever, that's not helpful in actually dealing with the reality of the problem, in the same way that like all of the high heels and pride flags are just a sticking plaster for what's actually going on within the institution.
Well, yes. Well, I don't know whether that's a sticking plaster in that sense. First of all, I would say that it's a cliche now to say something's institutional, this or that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to the point where I think it has no
It's meaningless.
effect.
It's it's become similar to saying very.
Yes, exactly. When was it
very,
first?
very, very, actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was very first used, wasn't it, in the Macpherson report, Stephen Lawrence report, I think. And I mean, basically, it's used about anything. I've even heard the NHS be called institutionally racist. I'm not questioning that these problems are there. I would look at it a slightly different way, not unlike with corporations now, is that the organisation stops doing the proper job when it becomes so concerned with woke issues.
And that's
So that's because there's no question about it. Was when I used to have to be on these committees at the London Assembly, the Police and Crime Committee. You dealt all the time with senior people. They were about as woke as you can't. They were very weak, and you thought, oh dear, 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 you know. But I think that actually the preoccupation with that is what maybe has allowed this stuff to simply
Well, and
flourish.
Joanna Williams concluded her article by essentially saying that she was concerned that, I hope that I'm not sort of misrepresenting her argument, but my understanding was that she was saying that she's concerned that if the police go on to focus on dealing with institutional racism, sexism and so on, rather than focusing on doing their job, which is solving crimes, that actually that's similar to what you're saying, Peter. That's what set things out of whack. They're focusing on doing all of these things. Like, I mean, it's incredible to think that one of the main things that we often criticise the police for is that they focus so much of their time and resources on policing people's tweets and now literally policing people's thoughts. And some of this as well, this is to do with bad law as well. It's to do with the police being asked to enforce things that they shouldn't be enforcing, whether it's by the College of Policing.
And they don't understand. The police wading into identity politics and woke it, they just don't understand it. They're not trained to do that. Okay, so and they shouldn't be anyway, because it's nothing to do with them.
So,
but there's just one more point, if I can make. The key thing here is crime prevention, isn't it? And being fully engaged with the main focus, the core objective of their job. If they're not engaged with that and they're interested in wearing high heels and being woke and dancing in the street at pride marches, one, nobody respects them. Okay, that's the main thing. And two, more to the point, deep down, a core institutional issue, if you like, they don't respect themselves, I don't think, because they're not doing their job. It comes back to what you're saying. They're not there doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think that is a real drain on morale.
So
it sort of it started a long time ago. I mean, it's a police service now, not a police force for a start.
Yeah.
That's one thing. The
I
other
would
thing
like
as well,
my
when you
police to be
said
a
crime
force.
prevention, that actually has not been the reason for the police for quite a long time. They're entirely reactive.
Yeah.
So hence no bobbies on the beat and all of that kind of thing. Every election, we're going to put more bobbies on the beat. Doesn't happen. But once upon a time it was about that. I mean, the point was that, you got to know the cops in your area and all of that, and he or she would become, cognizant of the area. They would know when things were going bad, things like that. Now they just turn up in these swooping cars, and in the meantime are not to be seen anywhere. And I think that you've got to go right back to Robert Peel's principles, actually. And also the other thing I think is very, very important is they're no longer seen as arising from the mass of people they're meant to be policing. And they were from the people. That's why there was always an incredibly good relationship with the police compared to
and now they're just a representation of middle class sensibility in the sense that coppers have to have a degree now. I don't think coppers need a degree.
That's crazy that police should have to have a degree.
And so it's that point you've made about them being for and of the community is so important, and
Terribly
that's the missing layer, isn't it? So I think what they need to do, what they need to take from this report, and they won't take it from this report, they'll just do more pride marches, there'll be more high heels and mascara, but what they need to take from this report is to go back to first principles of what policing means.
What you don't want them to be doing is doing more of that sort of performative stuff. So that it makes it look, because obviously that hasn't helped the situation at all. But here's what I think the sort of like crux of the question is that, so if you know, do you believe that if you were to just, for the to have the police force just solely focus on doing what the police are supposed to do, dealing with crime, getting rid of all of the extraneous stuff that everybody agrees that they shouldn't be focusing on, and then in addition to that, obviously, that one aspect of the Casey review's recommendations is to do with vetting, because obviously the police should be quite stringently vetted, and it seems that they haven't been. So those two things aside, do you think that that's enough, or do you think that there needs to be something in addition to that? Because when you start talking about cultural change, I noticed that in that LBC interview that Mark Rowley did with Nick Ferrari, that he was asked about recruiting more female police officers. And Mark Rowley said that they were about 30% female police officers, which I actually think is quite a lot. I'm surprised that there would be that many women who would want to be police officers. But I don't think that because the implication of that is that men are the problem.
Yeah.
How do you like?
Well, I heard him talk on whenever it was it Monday morning when this came out, and there was a real red flag for me, and he was so on the defensive, the poor sod. I mean, what else could he be, you know? But
I think he handled it quite well.
But there was one thing he said. I thought, oh no, you're going back. This is the heart of the problem. He was saying, look, we want more representation of different kinds of people. In other words, he was saying we want to recruit on the basis of gender, sex, and race. You know, and absolutely no. You recruit on the basis of who can do the job. You don't recruit on what people look like, how people act, and how people feel. And
hopefully not at the expense of vetting people.
Not at the expense of vetting
making sure
people.
Because you need to ensure that you're getting the best people for the job. It's like discriminating your way towards equality. It's just never going to work.
No, I think the one thing that really worries me, in a way, is the use of this term institutional, particularly institutionally racist. That plays right into the hands of everybody who's going on about, you know, systemic racism generally, and you know, critical race theory. The people who believe that everything is stacked against non-white people, and that plays right into their hands by using those terms. I again say, I think that the top brass have been so concerned with all this woke stuff that, in fact, yes, it has gone rotten. And as you say, there are too many instances for it just to be the odd one. Perhaps many of them are not of good caliber. They are, you know, that there's nothing worse than a mixture of wokery and thickness.
Which is what you've said time and time again whenever anything comes up about this, and I think it's the best description of what's going on.
But do you think that if the police were to just function as a police force traditionally, that all the rest would follow?
No.
Or do you think that the Met is now so rotten and so deeply messed up, like this stuff to do with the rape fridges is like so disturbing? But do you think that is it enough? Would the rest follow, or do they have to do something else, like breaking up the Met? Or
you can't just take the Met or the police force or law enforcement as a discrete entity. You have to take the whole thing, and they can't work on their own when the judiciary and the processes of lawmaking and you know, the courts don't function in any
and also
meaningful way
Parliament
either.
keep making these extremely vague laws.
Exactly.
Then they have to enforce things that, and not just Parliament either, the College of Policing with these NCHIs. I'm convinced that's another reason why public trust is at an all-time low. So it's this kind of toxic mixture of things.
Yes.
But I just don't think that, I'm not fully convinced that I'd like to think that with all institutions, if they just functioned with their proper telos, their proper purpose in mind, that the rest would follow. I'm just not entirely convinced, looking at this sort of like litany, and it's not just the stuff in the Casey review, it's the other stuff that we've been talking about for months and months and months. I'm just not completely convinced that, firstly, the Met could get back to just function, and not just the Met, but all police forces around the country could get back to just functioning as a normal, sort of just a basic police force.
So what would you put in their place?
I don't know. I don't, because I don't know what else you could do other than to just try and get them to vet them properly, ensure that you've got high caliber police officers, and to focus solely on the purpose of policing, and then maybe you could deal with individual instances around that. I don't know, but I'm asking you because I don't know.
There's a general crisis of authority, isn't there, in this country? I mean, everything seems to have lost its legitimacy and its legitimate authority, and that includes the police. The courts have too, actually, and certainly Parliament. So I think it's a broader malaise. I mean, it sounds like a real get out to say that, but I just think it is. These things happen when there is a general malaise.
It's far too simplistic to say we fix the police and everything else is going to fall into place. In a way, it's almost like the mirror image of intersectionality, isn't it? You know, people use intersectionality and say, well, women are oppressed because the working class are oppressed and because people of colour are oppressed, and it all fits together like that. Yeah. I think the opposite, the other side of the coin, is actually true. I think, you know, the police can't work if the judiciary doesn't work, if the institutions don't work, if education doesn't work. All of those things which are supposed to fit together and work like that, they just don't.
I wonder how much of it might be to do with the way that obviously the Met's a huge police force, that it might actually be, just in practical terms, it might be, you know, that the structure alongside the sort of vagueness, and so the way that the institution has developed and sort of swelled in size, whether that allows room for mediocrity, and the mediocrity allows room for abuse, and, you know, people I think
that's certainly the case, because with any large institution or corporation, there is always room for all of those things. But it comes down to leadership. It doesn't matter how big it is, it still comes down to leadership. But that's the crisis
of authority again, isn't it? Because people are not willing to properly take a leadership position. They're not willing to be very clear and say that's wrong and this is right. This is what our job is and that isn't what our job is. So their unwillingness to basically have the values that a police force needs to have, but it's probably part of the problem.
And it's an absolutely
integrity. It's a lack of integrity.
But it's an existential crisis for them, because you can't have a police force that is present on the streets, if it ever is, but which is cringing and apologetic in the face of criminality. It just doesn't work, you know. So you arrest someone and immediately they're going to say, well, this is sexism or this is racism. Prove to me it's not, you know. So it's an absolute crisis for them.
Shall we talk about Boris Johnson's lack of a legacy, perhaps? Because that's
kind of, I have to say, this has just kind of passed me by this a bit, because, you know, I think, sorry, I've just totally interrupted you there, actually, Emma, but I mean, I think what you're going to say is basically, should we look at Boris Johnson's legacy, and also particularly this investigation, this committee with COVID going on.
But I'd rather you tried to explain the rest than me.
There's been this about whether he knew he was breaking rules, or, you know, not about whether the rules were actually right or wrong.
Whether he recklessly misled Parliament.
Yeah, there's that going on, which is what you might call the Westminster bubble, 24-hour news cycle interesting bit. But then there's the other bit, which is basically that this is the third, in fact, I think to the day, if not yesterday, the third anniversary of the first lockdown.
Yeah.
And
it really is a case of what goes around comes around, isn't it?
And there have been lots of very good articles. Admittedly, there's been there's been a lot this week, actually, if you think about the, you know, whether it was a good thing to go into lockdown. I was always opposed to lockdown. From the start, it all felt off to me. It felt wrong. But, you know, you've had this week a superb article by Madeline Grant in the Telegraph, which was all about what lockdown kind of did and what it exposed about us, and not in a good way. And then you've had Piers Morgan, who for me became the kind of witch finder general of the whole thing, more or less saying, I was wrong, but it was because the science changed. Right. So I admit now that I made certain mistakes. So in
That's
other words,
why you're supposed to be humble in the first place, because science does that.
You're meant to be sceptical as a journalist, yeah. But the thing is,
it's almost like the science has moved on to. The science isn't bothered about that now. The science is about the environment now.
Yes,
that's where the
It
science
sounds like
has
the
gone.
problem
and that's
may
how
have
absurd
been.
it is.
The problem may have been his understanding of what science is.
I think it's just the point I was making in a very laboured way there. To me, that whole thing is much more interesting. I had locked now than what happens to Boris Johnson. But having said that, you asked that question. I've seen conflicting reports about him. Didn't he? Some people thought he was shafted, good and proper. Other people said he came out of it not so bad. But why are we all so concerned about his career?
About him? Yeah. Why?
I personally couldn't give a damn about whether. I mean, all the like silly details that came out during this hearing, whatever you should call it, about whether or not people in number 10 passed pens to each other. It's just all so petty. And for me, in the bigger picture...
Sorry, can I just interrupt? I was reading about that today. It's funny, my mind was half on it. And Boris Johnson was saying, I just read it very quickly, he said, nobody touched anybody else's pens, and for a second I felt it said so nobody touched anybody else's pens, and immediately I became outraged of Harrogate. I should think not at number 10. Oh, it's pens. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
Well, I can't remember who it was. Somebody tweeted, I think it was, saying I couldn't give a damn if Boris Johnson was like naked riding a space hopper around Downing Street. It's sort of besides the point. But for me, it's a case of, as we've discussed this many times, yada, 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 they didn't think that COVID was as bad as they were frightening everyone else into believing and so on. But also the fact that they created rules, regulations, laws, guidance, etc., that was so impossible for any human being to reasonably follow, that of course, being human beings, they fell foul of their own rules. I personally don't, I believe Boris when he says he didn't think that he was misleading the House. I don't think it really matters. I think it's a total waste of parliamentary time. I think there are a lot of things that the government could be really seriously having an inquiry into in terms of what actually happened during COVID. And this whole thing around Boris Johnson is a total waste of time and a total red herring. And I imagine, I presume I'm not alone in this. I'd love to know what people think in the comments. I just don't care.
No.
I'm just not interested in it at all.
No,
I know what you mean. Yeah.
It's cavalier on two fronts, really, wasn't it? The first front is ridiculously locking down people and essentially people dying because of it, and people being ill, and all of the abuse that came out of it as well, which I think we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And their attitude and behaviour amongst themselves in and around Downing Street. So it's a perfect storm of two idiot positions.
I think if you want to talk about accountability, you mentioned a few, like that there are actually quite a lot of people who have done a complete volte-face and have gone from people like Andrew Neil, for example, who have gone from like persecuting people who were sceptical, and nothing wrong with. I don't know if Andrew Neil has. I just know that he was one of the ones who put out one of those real strongly worded headlines. I don't know if he's actually taken a different stance on this, but I have seen a lot of people recently, you mentioned Piers Morgan, who have sort of accepted that they were wrong about these things. And I remember a long time ago there was one of these articles that sort of asked for an amnesty over when we're talking about the accountability of people who really, really strongly persecuted people who were just asking reasonable questions and were being skeptical, were being reasonable about the science, were saying, you might like to look at that, that looks like that, maybe we should be doing what Sweden is doing, maybe we should be questioning following China's public health policies on this and modelling ourselves after them. People who were discussing things like the lab leak theory that at one point were described as misinformation, and now we've come to a point where that seems to be the leading theory. So people behaved really unreasonably at the beginning of the pandemic. Yes, we can focus on the government and the government's decisions and what they did to us, But there are a lot of people who were complicit in basically silencing anybody who was making reasonable criticisms of the government, but they don't want any accountability for themselves.
I think that's the key point. And what's the thing that we want to get out of all of these discussions? And there's only one conclusion that we can draw, is that it must never happen again. But we're not really focusing on that, are we?
No, we're talking about pens being passed around.
Silly things. We're focusing on Matt Hancock and the whole soap opera around Matt Hancock. That dies down.
Whether or
and
not
we've
Boris
got
had
Boris
cake.
now. Yeah, whether Boris had cake. And it's these personalities which are it's a meaningless set of narratives in a way. It's why did this happen, and how the hell do we make sure that it doesn't happen again? That's the crux of it, and we're involved in soap operas.
I think there's an irony as well, isn't there, in focusing on Boris and people saying that, oh, Boris is trying to avoid responsibility for this and so on. But actually, a lot of the people who really were clearly, in hindsight, when you look at the evidence, and I don't think we haven't gone far enough in actually assessing the evidence and having a proper inquiry into the details of all of this stuff, particularly like excess deaths relating to public health policy.
We're just not asking the right questions. That's the problem.
But when we're reacting like, you know, Boris is trying to avoid accountability. But there are an awful lot of people who were very loud at the beginning of the pandemic and trying to silence reasonable people and to try and demonise reasonable people. And there's going to be no accountability for those people and no genuine, sincere apology from those people until the evidence is fully seen. And instead we're distracted by this whole narrative around Boris Johnson.
But the thing is, you won't get any kind of apology, because the people that we're talking about, when we keep saying there were very loud voices being like that, we're talking about the media. Let's be clear about that. They are not going to suddenly turn around and say we were wrong. It's just never in their, it's just not in their DNA in any way, shape or form. Do you remember those press conferences, which I think some people watched, you know, religiously, when they, every day at one point, I think those press conferences, because the questions were, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you locking down more? Why aren't you doing this more? Nobody sort of said, do you think maybe this is the wrong way? Nobody, none of them in the media said this. And also, for that matter, none of them asked where the thing came from in the first place. Wouldn't any self-respecting journalist
want to know that?
Say, well, actually, well, where is this thing from? No one, but none of them did. These are the people we're talking about. How can you hold a governing class to account when you are basically the visual display unit for that governing class?
You are, and behind that governing class is the civil service. But as well as the media, and I think you're absolutely right, the media were in the driving seat with this, the Labour Party as well.
Yeah.
Were
now they are avoiding accountability.
And they're completely
you wouldn't
avoiding
believe.
accountability. You know, there were one or two voices. Peter Hitchens obviously was the main one and the loudest one, and we had him here, didn't we? And you know, you had problems with the.
He was taken down.
He was taken down.
He was taken down.
You know, that's what it was like. That's the height of the hysteria, wasn't it? You know, you said anything against the lockdowns, you said anything against the narrative, you were closed down, you were shut up.
And I think that there are reasonable people who are concerned that some of what we saw with COVID and the policies, these top-down policies that are particularly draconian, I think there are reasonable concerns surrounding climate change policy. So when you say the main point of any inquiry is that this must never happen again, but you know, the narrative around even, you know, the way people now talk about Sweden, that's misleading, because some people are trying to make it look like they did have a lockdown in some way, you know. So I think.
But that's what I say when I say the science has changed now to the environment and the climate, and it's exactly the same narrative. It's the same panic.
And the people who were making reasonable objections, like those people who were complaining about 15-minute cities in Oxford. They are being tarred as fascists by so-called anti-fascists.
We're all far right, aren't we now? You know, if you're not a lunatic left-wing nutter, you are far right.
I think one thing that worries me actually slightly is that this, when they do the real inquiry, which is in some ways, you know, the Telegraph WhatsApp messages, they were kind of informal, precursors to that. When they do the real thing, cost a fortune, but something like 7 years, maybe I've heard, something like that. All the people that we're currently fretting about, they will all have gone in the midst of time, right?
Yeah.
So it'll come out, and I think my fear is that enough special interest groups will get around this inquiry for it to basically become a political kind of smorgasbord about ethnic breakdown,
yeah, of course,
about women breakdown, you know, in terms of deaths, etc. What this proves about us, that we're institutionally this, that, and the other thing. You know?
It'll be the same thing.
But by that point, I expect that a lot, like we were saying about climate change policy and so on, that when we talk about the word institutional and what it means, that actually a lot of these things that have resulted from COVID will have become genuinely institutionalized, like nudging and the use of behavioral science to try and manipulate people's behavior, to frighten them into obeying certain policies. And this attitude that we're now seeing with climate policy, not just here in the UK but across the world, like in the Netherlands or elsewhere, this top-down imposition of policies that are, quote, for your own good.
But isn't it exhausting though when you're on the wrong side of the narrative and you're proved right in one instance, and then the whole game is shifted onto another narrative, and you have to go through exactly the same process again, but you know what the outcome's going to be, because all of the signs are there for the environment narrative. It's exactly the same as the COVID narrative, the panic and all that, and it's almost like Sisyphus, isn't it, rolling a rock up the hill and then letting it fall down again, and then you have to go on to the next. You know, forgive me, but you know, sometimes you feel really disillusioned about the whole thing.
I think, unfortunately, we have to accept that those people who were really very wrong and behaved in ways that were reprehensible to their opponents, to critics, to skeptics, I think we're going to have to accept that those people are not going to admit that they were wrong. They're just going to double down, and that we're not really going to see proper accountability, because just like we were saying with the police force, the governing class has forgotten how to govern. The media class has forgotten how to behave with integrity within the mainstream media. Obviously, not all media organisations, but talking about like the BBC and so on. So, I think we just have to accept that no good is going to come of this, and that we are just going to have to move on to trying to mitigate things. To mitigate negative consequences of these things in other ways by refocusing on, you know, whatever is happening currently, rather than trying to get justice.
But we're fighting on so many fronts, because as you're talking about that, and I'm thinking about both of those things. I'm thinking about COVID, I'm thinking about climate. I'm also thinking about genderism and children as well. And we're proved right in that narrative as well. And yet they're doubling down after mermaids and Tavistock and all of those kinds of things. So they say we're waging a culture war. We're really not. We're fighting back against the culture war.
And when people are so invested, they are inevitably going to double down. Shall we talk about this final story this week, which is, so this year Ramadan has coincided with Lent, and in I believe it's the West End. I haven't actually seen it. It might be in Piccadilly Circus.
No, it's one street, Coventry Street, which is a connecting street. Quite a short street. Let's speak about this. It's a connecting street between Leicester Square and Piccadilly, basically.
And in Muslim countries, Ramadan lights are something that is quite popular. And we saw a photograph in the press of Sadiq Khan posing with these Ramadan lights behind him. So what's interesting about this is a very explicit, you know, for the very first time, sort of statement of Islam in the public square in a, you know, main street in London. Is it a main street?
Yeah, West End.
And obviously this is coming after the census results that we discussed months ago now. Christianity becoming a minority, Islam obviously being one of the growing demographics. So I thought was interesting about seeing this for me was that I wasn't surprised at all. It just seems like you would expect it. You know, there's not a great deal to say about it.
I think it's what I find fascinating, actually, well, actually horribly predictable is actually a better description about these things, is that the very people who don't give any house room to religion, who probably quite love the fact that Christianity is on the decline, and we're becoming more secular,
shouting about it from the rooftops.
they say nothing when it comes to Islam. So, for example, I would have thought they wouldn't like, if they're going to be principled about it, they wouldn't like to see celebratory lights for a religious happening.
No, actually, they're doing more than that. They're shouting about it from the rooftops because they're framing it in terms of inclusivity, and I don't think it's really that at all, or at least that isn't the impetus. I think the impetus really is about destroying the grand narrative of national identity, and it really is about deconstructing the unifying notion of tradition. And I think that's what they're really responding to, and they're framing. They don't give a toss about Islam. It's just one of those things.
Or they're using it.
They're using it, but what it is, it's almost like a palimpsest, isn't it? It's written on top of the national identity, and then it'll be scrubbed off, and then pride will be written on top of it, and then something else will be scrubbed off, and whatever's useful at that particular time to attack Britain and Britishness will be used, and Islam is just being used.
There's something sort of the way that you described that there about sort of one thing being then rubbed off and then another thing, and there's something sort of almost degrading to the people who are involved in those particular groups or cultures, that they're almost, that it's done in this sort of tokenistic way. I'm sure that there'll be lots of Muslims who will, very happy to see these lights up celebrating Ramadan and whatnot. But I think what's interesting to me is that we've seen this kind of like receding of Christianity from the public square, this sense that religion has to sort of like stay out of it. And even within the Church of England, like you see the increasing discussions about disestablishing the church, about the need to keep religion in the private sphere, that we are very much a post-Christian country now. It's sad for me to say as a Christian, but we're not a Christian country anymore. We have a Christianity baked into the very fabric of our being as a country and as a culture. But we have moved now to a point where we are a post-Christian nation. And so there's nothing really surprising to me about seeing these lights. But then I think it's a very short step from that, though, to having, say, the public call to prayer, which for me is, I like the sound of church bells, but I don't think I would feel comfortable with the call to prayer.
We are colonised by a set of ideologies, aren't we? And we see them by these visual symbols. I mean, the pride flag, or the hundreds of flags that represent sexual identities is one version of colonisation. This is another version of colonisation, and it's weaponising a religion. I'm not having a go here at Islam. I'm having a go at the people who are weaponising it, and it is a kind of colonisation, and it's a deconstruction of who we are and our past.
Well, the thing is that they're at variance with each other.
Yeah.
The sexual identity, the LGBTQ alphabet people, right? There's nothing between them and Islam, for example.
Well, this is sort of my point, is that you can't just...
It's my enemy's enemy, isn't it? That's I suppose that's the point I'm making. They will kind of congregate together against a common enemy, which is the West, which is Britishness, which is tradition, and all of those things. But it's the Queers for Palestine mentality, which I mentioned last week, and I've mentioned it again.
What most people's attitude, and I do share this bit, when they saw lights, Happy Ramadan, I think they will feel not happy or uncomfortable about it. Yeah. I think, and they will feel at the same time totally and utterly powerless to even express that.
But So one of the criticisms of like multiculturalism or group-based politics is that the diversity always stops at the boundary of the group. There's never any sort of recognition of the diversity within groups. And then you have this idea that they're basically interchangeable, that you can just replace Islam with LGBTQI plus whatever. Whereas actually probably you could, if you wanted to, I'm not saying anyone should, you could make the argument that, so a gay person could say, well, I feel that Ramadan in a public street like this is homophobic because in some Muslim countries they hang gay people from cranes and throw them off of rooftops, or because Islam says X, Y, and Z about homosexuals, and so I feel that this is homophobic. Or you could, in the reverse, you could say, well, I feel that having all of these pride flags in the public space is Islamophobic because it's I believe that this is a sin. So they're groups that are in conflict with one another.
That's why I say they're such uncomfortable bedfellows, and you have to ask yourself, why are they together in bed? You know, they're together in bed not because they want to be or because they've got any kind of understanding or concert of understanding. It's because it's what they're against. It's my enemy's enemy.
I think what really puts it into perspective is the idea that somehow, could you imagine seeing Happy Christmas lights going up in an Islamic country? Can you, in any Islamic city?
But the argument,
could you imagine official, because these are kind of official lights, you know, could you imagine them going up? No chance. No chance.
But in an Islamic country, whereas the argument would be that now we're no longer a Christian country.
Yes, but
we're a selectively secular
that's disingenuous
country.
And we all know it really
Of course.
Actually,
I mean,
the funny thing about all of this is that, sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but a bit like you say Lent, right? It's not a happy time, is it, Ramadan? I mean, everyone's fasting.
Well,
I mean, it's not like a celebratory time of eating and drink.
Well, the iftars at the end is a very celebratory thing, and it's the most holy month in the Islamic calendar, and so in that respect, it is kind of celebratory. It's sort of like Lent.
I kind of think that the religion thing is a bit of a red herring here. I think tradition is the main thing, and it's about our past, and it's about deconstructing, dismantling, and attacking our past. And religion is just the nearest weapon.
I think that the authorities, the Mayor of London, and so on, would not be so favourable to a very public display in London of the Lenten tradition. If we wanted to have a passion play, a traditional medieval passion play in Trafalgar Square, I can't imagine a photo of Sadiq Khan posing in front of it, very proud because of the diversity of London.
I can't imagine even that happening in York. Maybe it does.
I think, I mean, sort of goes to the heart of it is that the traditions that have, you know, and he said the traditional traditions of this country in Lent, many people I think probably don't really know anything about Lent or Lenten traditions anymore. But you would be surprised to see those in the public square in London, particularly in London or in any of the main cities where Christianity is, although I mean, actually, it depends on the community.
Do you know what would happen if you saw them? Do you know what the response would be? They would be denigrated immediately as being far right. That's what the response would be.
And I imagine that you probably would have people making those sorts of criticisms of it's homophobic or transphobic or, you know.
Yeah. Oh yeah, all of those would pile onto the top of it, but essentially it would be right wing, it would be exclusionary, it would be all of those things.
Well, what a way to end my last episode. Thanks,
well, we
guys.
Always end on a very, very melancholy note.
So thank you so much for
having
me for all of these episodes. I don't even know how many we've done now, but thank you so much.
We'll see you at our conference on the
and I will be
22nd of April.
And you are going to be a guest here quite a lot, aren't you?
You're not going to be able to get rid of me that easily.
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Peter. Thank you, Philip.
Emma.
And thank you for watching, not just this episode, but to all of you who have watched so many episodes until this point. Personally, thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments below about the topics that we've been discussing here today. And I am sure at some point I will see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.